This is Beyond Crude, a Stop EACOP campaign podcast series that explores the economic, social, and governance impact in Uganda and Tanzania. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 5th episode of Beyond Crude, the Stop EACOP campaign. And over the past 6 months, we've had interesting conversations around this project, its impact on the environment, but also the impact on individual lives. And today, I'm joined in studio by 3 guests to just build up more on that same conversation that we've been having and the impact that it continues to have on the lives of people along the stretch. So joining me today is, I'll start to my right.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rukia Hamis. I'm the Africa Senior Organizer for the 50 Africa, and I'm happy to be here.
Karibu sana.
Hi, friends. My name is Omar El Mawi. I work for the people of Africa. My job is just to make sure that I make this continent better for the 1.3 billion people that live and exist within this continent. Happy to join you for this important conversation today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Raya Famau Ahmed, and I'm a gender/environmental activist in Lamu. And I'm also the executive director of Lamu Women Alliance and also the board member of Save Lamu organization. Happy to be here today with the rest of the team. And I also want to be part and parcel of the conversation that is going on beyond Crude episode. Thank you.
Yeah, so starting with you, Raya, and we're glad to have you here. Looking at the Lamu coal plant and the challenges with that, do you think it looks, and in what ways does it look similar to the EACOP campaign? And what kind of an impact? What are your general thoughts on this EACOP project?
Okay, I think let me first start by saying that as Lamu people, as Kenyan people, we were privileged to stop one of the most environmental hazards project that was proposed to be built in Lamu. As community, we raised our concerns and we went to court and we petitioned that this project should not go on. And we were lucky that the court ruled on our behalf. And as we are talking, the project was stopped. And the reason that we went to court is because the world is now evolving and everybody is using renewable energy. And we all know that EACOP and coal, all these are fossil fuels that we don't need in the face of abundant renewable energy in the region, because we have abundant energy that we possess in East Africa. So because this is an unrenewable energy, that is why we went to court to stop this. And I think EACOP is similar to what was proposed to be done in Lamu. So as I think as East African people, we need to oppose strongly. And I support the opposition to EACOP and the community because especially, when environmental hazards happen, women and children will be really affected. Is what we are experiencing now, the floods and the hurricane Hidaya, what is happening. Women are really affected and children. Thank you.
Yeah, something Raya has mentioned, Rukia, just coming to you, about the potential for, a vast potential for renewable energy in Africa and in the region in particular. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you so much. I agree with Raya that the potential for renewable energy in Africa is quite vast. And I feel like this century we're in, or this time, is an opportunity for the continent to be leaders in how we want to see innovation and energy that builds access to every individual. We've seen quite amazing cases, case in point, Kenya, where we're from, where there is access. Major part of the grid is supplied by renewable energy. Although there's some tweaks here and there, it still works for the country. And why can't we emulate countries as such? There's situations in Ghana where policies are pro renewable energy. And I feel like conversations that are still trying to convince the continent that we need fossil fuels are just trying to bring us a bit back and take us backwards and make Africans, stay where they are when there's massive opportunities for us to really be at the forefront in leading some of these renewable energy innovations that will bring forward decentralized, affordable energy access to communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then that would mean transition. It's a word that comes up a lot, transition. Coming to you, Omar, what does just transition look like in the context of fossil fuel energy to renewable energy? What is just transition?
And that's a really good question you asked. Before I even speak to that, I just wanted to quickly comment on the renewable energy potential for Africa. Like research after research has really clearly stated that Africa has at least 39% of the renewable energy potential in the whole world. So we have more potential than any other continent in the whole world. And the unfortunate thing is less than 2% of the financing of renewable energy is coming to Africa. So we're not getting enough resources for us to exploit this. And therefore, we are seeing a situation where, people are not putting an importance on something that's really important and an opportunity here that they can provide energy for a lot of Africans that need it and also make money out of the same. Now, the question that we've asked me around what a just transition should look like for Africa, I think the place we should begin from is that we need to acknowledge that Africa is pretty different compared to all the other continents that you're speaking about, at least most of the continents in the global north. And to that effect, you will see that more than half of the continent don't have access to energy. So we have over 600 million people that are energy poor, don't have access to electricity, not just energy, but electricity. We have close to 1 billion people that lack access to clean cooking. And by clean cooking here, I mean, electronic cooking, not gas. And therefore, more than 1 billion, close to 1 billion people are using biomass, firewood and all that as a source of energy to be able to either provide heating within their homes or even provide the energy to cook their daily things that they need to cook within their homesteads. If you look deeper into this, you'll realize that, close to, if my figures are right, close to 700,000 people are dying from indoor pollution. That's more death in Africa. That's more deaths than you're having from HIV and AIDS. So actually, indoor pollution is a bigger catastrophe within the continent than even HIV and AIDS. And what this therefore means is a just transition for Africa will be totally different from a just transition that we're talking about all the other different continents, especially from those in the global north. And therefore, we're talking about a continent that people are energy poor, people are dying from indoor pollution. And therefore, what we need to do is not to cut on emissions, because less than 4% of the historical emissions, carbon emissions globally, are coming from Africa. So Africa doesn't have any business in terms of cutting emissions, because we don't have emissions anyway to start with. What we need to do is to transition or to come up with solutions that are as much as possible dealing away or avoiding emissions altogether. And what this therefore means is that our just transition pathway should be one that's leapfrogging from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. And that's possible because, many countries in Africa, including Nigeria, for instance, have been exploiting their oil for so long. But Nigeria, which is the biggest oil producer within the continent, is exporting 100% of its crude oil and importing 100% of the oil and fuel that they need for their local consumption. And what this therefore means is that whatever they are getting from selling that oil, they have to pay even more by importing the same oil so that they can utilize it within their daily needs. And therefore, what we need to be speaking about is how therefore do we come up with a plan that is climate compatible, but also it's the easiest way to decentralize and make sure that this energy and this electricity gets to the people in a faster way, in a cost-effective way, and we are not necessarily worried about exacerbating the energy. To me, that's what a just transition for the continent should look like.
Okay, thank you for that. And coming to you, Raya, you've worked in this space, especially with the Lamu coal plant, and we know that in these kinds of situations, it does not affect everyone the same. So from your experience with the women you deal with and minorities in that space, what kind of complaints and effects and challenges do you see happening to people on the ground, and potentially what will happen to people if EACOP is built?
Yes, I think what I can add up to what my other colleagues have been saying, in Lamu, we were very lucky that the project was not implemented. We stopped it before it started. And we had all information on what coal power plant project brings to a community, because some of us traveled to South Africa in Mpumalanga and we witnessed the destruction of the environment, water sources, air, and everything because of coal power plant project. And if we scale it down to women, women are environment by nature. We are the custodians of this environment because we take care of our fathers and our husbands who look after the environment. So if anything happens to the environment, if there's any climate change effect, then it affects more women and children because they're going to be displaced. If there are floods like what we are experiencing right now in all over the world, there's a lot of floods. We had a prolonged drought in our country, and women are really affected because as the custodians of this environment, as custodians of nature, like here in Lamu, if I can give an example, women do not do farming, women do not do fishing, but they depend wholly on what their man or their husband brings to home. That is the earning that they take care of the family. So they have to be on the forefront to protect the environment and make sure nothing happens, because anything that happens to the environment, then women and children bear the significant brunt to these episodes of climate change.
Let's talk a bit energy financing. I mean, there are all these big numbers thrown around every time there's a conference around here. There are all these sort of players. Does this money get to the right people? And do you think going by the current trajectory is going to help us effect this transition?
Yeah, thank you, Darius. And this is where I think everything comes into the just transition, where that you need to really include justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion when you think through how you're supporting these communities, access, funding that would help them transition. There's a model right now happening which is called the Just Energy Transition Plan Partnerships, which it's money or funding given to countries that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels to support them or support their efforts to transition to, renewable energy and more equitable energy access for their communities. At the moment in the continent, South Africa and Senegal have received JET-P, and there's still issues. They've received money, but there's still issues in terms of how that money is used in the countries themselves. And I appreciate that question because it comes down to, are these principles of the JET-Ps being implemented? And there's a lot of work that's happened with different civil society to come up with different principles that will guide how we spread out the funding that comes from the JET-Ps and any other sources or models of funding and financing in the continent. And now there's a trend where it comes around issues of carbon markets and ETC that are trying to use the same model of we are financing the just transition to really confuse the pathway that we need to take, which is quite direct and just saying, hey, we need to shift away from fossil fuels and try and find not one-size-fits-all model that works for each country in the continent to move us to where we need to be. I appreciate Omar's example of Nigeria, and it's sad that Nigeria has been producing, oil all this time. They have one of the richest men in the continent. But when you go to Nigeria, literally electricity in a hotel, they're using generators just to power electricity in the hotel. I think generators are like the booming business in Nigeria. So that shows you if that model isn't working. And so I don't understand how we're still blinded by false solutions, And I think people have always been discussing why financing is not really always a solution. It's just fixing the result. But the root problem is the system that can be able to really work and implement the financing that's coming in is where we need to really think through. As in, we need to figure out models and look into research that's already happening across the continent and with different partners and civil society that work and that prioritize, bringing that funding to actually fix the root problem, whereas the system is messed up. There's a lot of corruption that's tainting all this support that we're asking for. You find amazing civil society partners like Omar and the rest who are fighting hard to bring, let's bring the finance, let's, bring reparations to the continent. But if the system is still messed up and it's still tainted with corruption and lack of governance and lack of policy, we'll always end up in this situation where we're asking for money, but it doesn't really help our communities as it should.
Yeah, that's interesting because, just coming to you, Omar, on this. When you look at how those conversations go, especially sometimes within that financing space, people talk about energy efficiency, not necessarily energy transition. It's like, does fossil fuel really have to be part of this package, Omar? Or is there a way to actually work around this to ensure this transition is something that takes us towards a space of clean energy?
Thanks. It's a really good question. Just to agree with Raya and Rukia as well. And perhaps before I answer that question, the problem is, I think where we've gotten it wrong for Africa when you talk about just energy transition is the fact that we are looking at just transiting from one energy to the other, but we are not looking at, for what? Why do we need the energy transition? Why do we need the energy for the first place? And therefore we should be speaking about energy for production, talking about how can we provide energy for a continent that is energy poor in a way that is climate compatible, but also in a way that improves the lives of people. So you're actually speaking about development so that we can have more and more people's lives being improved. Now, for the question you've asked around whether fossil fuels have a part to play in energy efficiency, I just wanted to begin because we are assuming that everyone understands what energy efficiency is. And perhaps it's important for me to just quickly mention that, for energy efficiency, the easiest way that I could define it would be where we are talking about, reducing the amount of energy that one is requiring to provide certain products or certain services. And if I could use an example on a day-to-day life, if you were to take or move a load from one place to the other, energy efficiency will be different. If you're using your own hands by carrying it, you will lose more energy. If you're using a cart, it might mean it's more energy efficient. It means you're using less energy. If you could use a pulley, or you could use, whatever those other sophisticated gadgets we learned in physics back when we were in school. But what it means is just provide the same amount of energy, but in a way that is more efficient, and you can do the works that you need to do. And the reason why it's important is mostly two reasons. The first one is it's cost effective, which means you are saving the amount of money that you would have spent. For instance, if you have to light a bulb in a house for 1 hour, and you have, if you're using the more energy intensive bulbs and you're using the less energy intensive, it means the cost, the kilowatt hour that you will use for that particular period will be different, which means you're paying more to the electric provider. And why this is important, first is the cost savings, but secondly, it's the climate aspect that it plays. Because if you're using less energy, it means you have to use to produce less energy and carbon emissions, especially if you are in a country that most of its energy is being driven by fossil fuels, especially in the automobile in the automobile sector, where most people who are using public transport and transport in general are using cars that are fueled by petrol or diesel, and therefore if you have a more cost energy efficient cars, it means you're using less petrol, which means less greenhouse gas. I hope that sort of provides the context in terms of what this is. Now, for the question that we've asked in terms of do fossil fuels have a place to play? I mean, my understanding is that no, in fact, fossil fuels have gotten us to this problem that we're in today. And actually, if you're talking about energy efficiency, it's really hard to talk about energy efficiency without renewable energy. Both the two play a big role within each other, and they go hand to hand, so to speak, especially if you're talking about sustainable energy policies. And just to give an example, if you are to most of the fossil fuels, the infrastructure or the cycle that it has to go before it's ready for usage, it's quite a lot of energy intensive processes that have to go through. So let's talk about, for instance, we're talking about EACOP here, the East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline, and the oil that has to be extracted in Uganda. You'll have to need a certain amount of energy to extract that oil. You'll need more energy to get that oil from the western part of Uganda through the pipeline 1,400 kilometers later in Tanzania, which has to be heated because that oil is quite heavy and waxy. And that means you're using more energy to keep pumping that oil all the way to Tanzania. It has to get into ships, in tankers. Those ships are using fossil fuel, which also have to be powered. And then they have to go all the way, to the global north, into oil refineries. It's going to be refined, more energy is going to be used, put put back into tankers and brought back into where it's going to be consumed. So that whole process is really energy intensive, and therefore you cannot be talking about energy efficiency in a process that is already by itself, it's quite hard for us to deal away with it. But on the flip side of it, if you're talking about renewable energy, it actually means you just have to bring turbines if you're talking about wind, or you have to bring in the solar panels, capture the energy that you need to get. And once that energy is gotten from the turbine or from the solar panel, it can already be utilized, whatever needs it has to go to, either charging your car, if you're using an electronic vehicle, charging your phones, using them for, household energy issues, and many, lighting and other aspects. So if you're talking about energy efficiency, you really cannot be talking about fossil fuels. And the other argument that I want to bring to the table is the fact that, the fossil fuel companies are making a lot of money by making sure that energy efficiency is not something that is being acted on. Because what it means is, if you're getting more energy efficient vehicles, which are using less petrol, it means less profits for the fossil fuel companies. And therefore, the fossil fuel companies and the fossil fuel sector really has no role to play. And if you're bringing them into the table, then you can guarantee that whatever ideas, whatever actions that they are going to suggest are always going to be taking us back deeper into the problem than actually delivering us into the solutions that we need to see.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just coming to you, Raya, one of the things I know they wanted to do with the coal facilities, they wanted to cut down mangrove trees, and you're very opposed to that, which is the same challenge the EACOP project wants to do around the port of Tanga, especially the Chongoleani area. What's the importance of these mangrove trees to your local communities? And based on your experience, Raya, do you think the people of Tanga should be concerned about this plan to cut down the mangrove trees?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And I think what is happening in Chengelani in Tanga is similar on what was proposed to happen in Lamu. Because when we petitioned the coal power plant, one of the components that we petitioned the government was massive clearing of mangrove forest. And I'm aware that this is also going on in Chengelani in Tanga. And I think that the people of Tanzania should be aware on the importance of conserving the mangrove vegetation. I think mangrove in general sustains local communities by providing them with seafood. And we also know that sometimes, depending on the people, like here in Lamu, mangrove is also used as medicinal herbs, which cures some of the diseases that affect people in Lamu. And it's also home to many sea animals. It's their breeding areas for the sea animals. And I think it also taps rains, what we are experiencing right now, because when there's a lot of mangrove conservation in an area, it mitigates the impact of climate change by sequestering carbon and protecting the coast from storms. Like right now, what we are experiencing, the Hidaya hurricane, if you have really distracted the mangrove, then the impact will be very, very big, because mangrove conservation really protect the coastal regions from these storms. So it is very important for people of Tanzania to also know the importance of preserving mangrove. And governments are government. Government doesn't care what will happen, because in our case, we were asking the government that if you're going to destroy all these chunks of mangrove, what are the mitigation measures that we are going to make? And the government did not have any answers for that. So if you are going to destroy the breeding areas of a lot of mammals in the sea, this will also affect the economy of the people, because we also depend on mangrove, because we cut wood and we get timber and we build our houses using the mangrove timber. We make furnitures, and that is one component that spurs economic growth in an area. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. Coming to you, Rukia, we are looking at EACOP. That's 1,400 kilometers, thousands of families affected, but it's just one of those projects, within the continent, that in a sense, we do not pollute as much as the other continents, and yet we take a significant hit, impact from the use of all these fossil fuel. Is there a way to mitigate that? How do we get our voice in there, given that we're taking a bigger hit than our contribution to this mess?
Yeah, that's, I guess, sad part of where we're at. At the same time, I think it's also an opportunity for us. I think we need to be in a situation where we feel as Africans, we're not victims of climate crisis, but take this as an opportunity for us to rise above it and figure out ways to really build a capacity and be ready for this. And I think that's when issues on, disaster preparedness come across. Just taking a cue from Raya, mentioning around the floods and the cyclone Idaya and the rest. The issue with our continent at the moment is our disaster preparedness models are quite inefficient and insufficient. And why the reason is that is because we're looking at the climate crisis as one issue where it just affects only the environment. But we need to have an holistic, very dimensional view of how the climate crisis is. And in the same way, use the way the climate crisis is to solve it in the same place. And when it comes to the Stop EACOP or campaign, which is the Stop the East African Crude Pipeline campaign, it's recently launched a couple of years back a model called the iGen network, which is a network around green economy. And what this network tried to do was to use the intersectional aspect of the climate crisis to solve it or support communities in Uganda and Tanzania. And looking at fisheries communities, looking at issues on water, issues on farmers, etc. And all of these people coming together and putting their heads together to figure out different solutions to the climate crisis that don't really rely on just continuing to mine fossil fuels, but also what else can we do and to bring up the rest of the economy so that we don't really need to feel like fossil fuels are the only thing that can serve us in our economic issues. So, for example, you may find like maybe Uganda feels like when they tap into the East African Crude Pipeline, they'll make money. But when you look at other sectors and you build them up and you come together and work on disaster preparedness, then that means when the climate crisis continues to exacerbate the continent, we are ready to, work on this. Countries like Japan, although it's far away from our continent, you realize they have earthquakes, they have but they always bounce back so quickly because their rapid disaster preparedness is like on point. So our continent is hit, one, because we're not prepared, and two, because we're still focusing on false solutions to what our economic saving would be. We feel like we need to still stick to the old ways to be able to rise up. And I feel like we need to really tap into resources that we already have, whether it's our forests, our wildlife, our fisheries, water, etc., and maximize on those, but also making sure that we have plans in place to really maximize on their input into the economy so that we don't fall into this trap. And all of this still ties together to issues on energy, because the nexus between food, energy, water, they're all tied together, whether we like it or not. So we need to stop looking at that crisis and the climate crisis as a standalone issue. And once we do that and we plan around every aspect of the economy and every aspect of the environment, social, etc., then I think it will reduce how bluntly we get affected. And like I said again, I think Africans, the continent, the people of Africa are very resilient, are very bright. We have the youngest population in the world that are constantly innovating different ways to, move us top of the ladder in conversations on economy and how we're making it. So I think we need to tap into what we have and show the world, how we can lead these conversations on energy, lead conversations around disaster preparedness, conversations around innovations on how we can beat the impacts of the climate crisis.
Yeah. And interestingly, I think when we were getting started, we mentioned the IEA conference, which will be here on, I think, on 21st and 22nd. What's interesting is this is the first time it's being held in Africa and in Nairobi. And then coming to you, Omar, what's just your general sense of, first of all, having it here? And do you see this as an opportunity for us to be able to, get our foot in the door and put our voice on the table?
I mean, it's something I've been grappling with. And I don't know whether it's one of the reasons why people call me a pessimist, but the fact that something is happening in your doorstep doesn't always necessarily mean that you are going to be calling the shots in terms of what's happening. We saw it with COP27 when it was happening here in Africa, in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh. But the conversations, when you have developed countries coming into a process that they have a lot of say and a lot of sway in terms of how the discussions will go, it really rarely matters where that conference is being held because they are always going to be calling the shots. Kenya is a very small gun, if you're talking about the decision makers that are involved within that whole process. And therefore, unless and until as Africa and as a continent, we come together, unite and speak in terms of what really matters for the continent, what do we want to see, what's our plan, what's our plan in terms of the development of the continent, what's the vision that we have for this continent, what are the energy uses we need to see and we need to develop, and how do we do this in a climate compatible way. That's the only way that we can, rise up and speak up against these many other competing interests within the whole conversation and the whole conference for us to be able to get there. I just wanted to conclude by mentioning that, but before that, it's important, and I think this is captured within the text of the background information on the conference itself. They mentioned that, energy efficiency has to be coupled with affordability, security, and access. And that's the only way to really address the climate crisis. Because if you have energy efficiency, but it's expensive, then you won't be able to get people utilize the energy efficiency. If it's not providing the security, which means, for instance, you still have to import some of this energy from other parts of the world, it's still a problem. And then lastly, if you're having energy efficient vehicles or bulbs in your home, but you actually don't even have access to the energy, then it's a conversation that we shouldn't even be having to begin with. For me, and what I've always said is, one, the fossil fuel companies and sector should never have a role in terms of the discussions that are being discussed there, because they are competing against any solutions that might be brought into the table. And the example that I always use, like trusting them in this discussion is like trusting an arsonist, someone whose job is to keep lighting other people's houses on fire, trusting them with a firefighting job. It's impossible that they're going to be doing that job because it's something that goes against everything that they believe in and that they stand on. And the fossil fuel sector have known about climate change for decades. Over 70, 80 years ago, they've known about climate change. They've continuously supported research that has denied the climate and the involvement of fossil fuels around it. They've continuously paid PR companies to keep pushing and show that they're actually doing something around dealing with the climate crisis when they actually are not. And they're already receiving a lot of money as subsidies. Over $7 trillion US was given in 2022 to fossil fuel sector, just so that the rest of the world can get the fossil fuels. So for me, they don't have a role to play in this, because at the end of the day, whoever has caused the problem should not be involved in terms of coming with the solution, because they have a conflict of interest. I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Coming to you, Raya, what's your word of encouragement from your experience in dealing with these kinds of energy challenges? What is your word of encouragement to especially those across in Tanga in terms of the fight they're having to stop EACOP?
Okay, word of encouragement that I can give the people of Tanga is they need to continue with the fight, because the journey is not that smooth. Fighting for fossil fuels is very difficult in the African continent. So they need to have the passion and the faith to continue fighting for their environmental rights. That is one. Two, they need to involve and reach out to other organizations, other players, other partners that can also help them amplify their voices in fighting against fossil fuels. Like here in Kenya, we formed a movement in Nairobi because the coal power plant was to be implemented in Lamu, but we wanted more players to come in and amplify our voices. So we formed a movement in Nairobi called Decolonize, which brought together all environmental defenders organizations, partners, donors, and everything on board, which also my learned friend there, Omar, who was the coordinator there, the former coordinator, and this really helped the movement and the fight against power plant. Then other thing that I also want to add is they need to involve women and youth against this fight of fossil fuel, because women voices matters a lot. And here in Lamu, especially in Kenya, women voices really mattered. That when we went in front of the environmental tribunal judges, they were really sad. They really felt the cry for women, and by telling the government to stop this project, because we knew if this project was to be implemented in Lamu, then a lot of women will be affected. And the less that the court listened to the voice of the voiceless, which is being represented by women. So I think it is a very good component for them also to engage more women in this fight against fossil fuels in EACOP.
Yeah, thank you. Rukia, paths to the future. What should we keep in mind even as we fight and argue and debate and try to get to this energy efficient future?
Yeah, I think thanks, Darius, and I love those words of inspiration from Raya. She's a massive and big female leader in our community and in the world. Anyone who knows her is honored to that. I think we need to fight, but we need to fight with a vision. Let's keep fighting, but having a sense of direction as to where we want to see things be. And I guess that's why we're here having the discussion around just transition. So you're fighting for no fossil fuels, but where do we want to be? And that's the most important thing that we need to put. Let's have a picture, a vision board of what the ideal Africa and people of Africa, what's the utopia that we want to see when everything is done, when we fought the good fight and we've won, what next for our communities? Thinking through that together, as continents, as civil society, as governments as well. I think let's not leave anyone behind. Let's not focus on just us civil society are doing this. Let's pull in our governments, because we're paying taxes, and that's taxpayer money. That's how can we tap into public finance to push the just transition and to where we want to be.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Rukia. Thank you, Raya. Thank you, Omar. Always a pleasure. You can catch this conversation on Spotify, SoundCloud, and follow us on social media at Stop EACOP.